Welcome everyone to the final roundtable discussion of our series, This Is Not Who We Are, or Is It? Democracy, Insurrection, and the Myth of American Exceptionalism. I'm pleased to have back all of our participants, our speakers for the series in alphabetical order: Dr. Sherry Cash, Dr. Peter DeSimone, Eric Halliday, Robert Halliday, Rachel Hanna, Dr. Clem Harris, Dr. Luke Perry, and Dr. Daniel Tagliarina, who've all taken a nice chunk out of their schedules to participate in this series, to prepare the papers, and really do a yeoman's job wrestling with what has become I think a very difficult question, and but very serious and popular topic, a concerning topic in American history. So just kind of the ground rules for this evening. They're very few, honestly. Some of us have prepared statements, others don't. Once we make everyone gives their statements, it's a discussion, which includes both the panelists and members of the audience who I've really appreciated your participation for the last month, because that's how long we've been doing this. So with that, I will just give a brief statement to kind of center us on this whole notion of American exceptionalism. So as I see it, there are three pillars of American exceptionalism that are described in the Declaration of Independence and that are contained in the sentence examined by Luke Perry last week. That is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the first pillar from the time of the American Revolution was establishing a country based on a new political framework where citizens, not subjects, would govern themselves. This is the society that Ronald Reagan would eventually call the shining city on the hill. But European observers at the time, and even a century later, called unworkable and bordering on anarchy. Nonetheless, Americans somehow seem to make it work. Yet, as Dan Tagliarina eloquently discussed in the second talk in this series, American democracy is rife with undemocratic institutions. The second pillar, of course, is capitalism and free trade. This is what defined the self-made man in America, because royal titles and heredity supposedly counted for little. Of course, one of the monkey wrenches in this equation was slavery and its legacy, because liberty and the pursuit of happiness were always beyond the reach of African Americans, even after emancipation, and I would argue to this day. In their talks, Clem Harris and Sherry Cash clearly showed that despite the sacred words in the Declaration of Independence, all men are not created equal, and that attacks on racial and ethnic minorities were common and accepted by most in American society. The final pillar of American exceptionalism, and the one, if you Google American exceptionalism, you'll find the most, is foreign policy, which from the start has always been America first, long before Donald Trump borrowed the slogan from the largely anti-Semitic America First Committee that opposed America's entrance into World War II. We've set economic policies and have been engaged in wars for selfish reasons and have been responsible for civilian deaths of near genocidal proportions. The firebombing campaigns of Japan are but one example. General Curtis LeMay, in fact, the man who orchestrated them, stated to his aides after the war that if we hadn't won, we would be charged as war criminals for the deliberate bombing of civilian targets. And World War II is neither the first nor last time Americans fought wars in that manner. Our bombing campaigns and use of chemical agents were responsible for over 1 million civilian deaths in the Vietnam War. In short, American foreign policy is neither exceptional nor different from the countries we often condemn. Regardless, there seems to be some kind of an unwritten rule, an almost fanatic devotion to the idea of American exceptionalism, a refusal to accept the fact that America and Americans are no more exceptional than any other people or country that claims the moniker. Barack Obama got in trouble for making this statement. I believe it was when he was running for president. Events of the last year, however, may have given us pause, or at least given some of us pause. The murder of George Floyd, the rise of white supremacy and its apparent acceptance in society, not to mention the support of the former president, congressmen who legislate for their careers rather than the law, a botched pandemic response, and an insurrection launched by a populist president intent on stealing the election have laid bare, contrary to what President Biden claims, this is who we are. The question from my perspective, and that I'd like to explore this evening, is where do we go from here? And with that, I yield the floor to whoever would like to jump in with their statement. I guess that's going to be Robert. He's itching to speak. Or get it out of the way, one or the other.
Well, I was until you stole my thunder and said half the things I was intending to say.
That's why I went first.
But I think that what David said has been very interesting. When you look at the lineup of talks, it's sometimes hard to see what exactly the thread is that links them all together until you've actually listened to them. And I think that for me anyway, looking at this, the forces that led to January 6th were neither unique either in place nor in time, because as Clemmy Harris and Sherry Cash showed us, these are things that go back a long way in US history. And as Eric Halliday and Rachel Hanna and Dan Tagliarina showed us, they are woven deeply into our culture, both our popular culture, digital culture, legal culture, all of those things. It's also not an American thing. Peter DeSimone was very clear about that in his talk, and looking at the parallels between what happened in pre-Nazi Germany and early Nazi Germany and what happened here. And it's also not something that's going to stop now. It doesn't stop with the election, as Luke Perry very eloquently told us. It's going to affect the future. It's going to affect the nature of the presidency and the future of where we go as a country. So we may be academics, but these are not academic questions. And I wanted to go back to what I said in my opening, my talk when I was opening the series, and requote and say, what then must we do? Because we have spent 20 some hours of time across all of our various talks, and they have been wonderful, and I have learned a huge amount from them. But if we are not doing something, this will happen again. And we're not, as I said in my opening talk, superheroes who have to swoop in and save the day, but we are citizens. We are informed citizens. We are concerned citizens. And the question that we really need, I think, to address this evening is, what then must we do?
I'm happy to go next if that's okay with everybody.
Absolutely.
And I've got a short statement, and I think it relates to some of what Dr. Halliday said. And so I think it's a good fit at this moment. So I'd like to briefly share two key views that perhaps merit further discussion. The first, methodological, and the second, substantive. First, I believe the insurrection's roots were derived from historical and institutional dynamics, insightfully discussed by my colleagues, as well as cultural, theoretical, sociological, and psychological considerations that I and others sought to emphasize. And one of the interesting things about this particular venue, I think, is that because we have several of us with different disciplines, we get to draw on different tools to try to make sense of the very complicated situation. And we're probably not all going to do that the same way, which I find really interesting and really beneficial in terms of educational value. The second view is that I believe the insurrection was grounded in a long history of white supremacy, but was not a clear carbon copy of early historical moments, particularly regarding the modern presidency, nor is Donald Trump and the insurrection he inspired so powerful that his brand of politics is primed to become a dominant force for years to come. Now, no doubt, President Trump shattered countless norms of the presidency and modern democracy in America for personal and partisan gain, which deeply concerns my discipline of political science. Longstanding historical and institutional dynamics do not fade quickly, but historically unpopular one-term presidents typically do, particularly when they, as with reference by Dr. Whitner, fail to mobilize the country beyond a deadly national crisis, and their party is voted out of both chambers of Congress and the White House in just a few years. Still, it's vitally important to understand how conservatives, as well as liberals, interpret the Trump presidency, a perspective that I think is a bit lacking, even in well-intentioned and valuable discussions like this. My scholarship over the last decade suggests that Republican Party dynamics and electoral politics cannot be completely understood through descriptions of ignorance, racism, or fear of Donald Trump. At the same time, leadership is necessary at all levels of government and society to restore America on a clear trajectory to continue expanding democratic norms, as Dr. Harris and I discussed following my talk. And this needs to unfold, and this leadership needs to be particularly focused in cultivating a multiracial conception of democracy that has been lacking throughout American history. I think this will require sober, nuanced, interdisciplinary assessments, which I think we've all done our best here to provide. So I'm reminded of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he said, quote, "Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds," unquote. Like muscles strained through great exertion, my personal hope and focus is working toward our country emerging from this moment with an even stronger and more inclusive democracy than we had 5 short years ago. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Luke.
If you don't mind, Dr. Whitner, I'd like to follow.
Absolutely.
Barry. I'd like to thank Dr. Halliday and Perry for their wonderful opening statements. Folks, shortly after the deadly insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6, 2 Black officers, the Capitol PD, gathered in the rotunda. Based on a BuzzFeed news story, the veteran Black officer who participated in the interview joined another Black officer in the rotunda, and in his words, quote, "Tears just started streaming down my face," unquote. "What the F, man?" unquote, he said. Quote, "Is this America? What the F just happened? I am so sick and tired of this SH," unquote. Soon the Black officer began screaming so that all within the rotunda, especially his white colleagues, could hear what he had just experienced. Quote, "These racist A's, terrorist," unquote, he shouted. "I just got called the N-word 15 times today. Trump did this, and we got all of these effing people in our department that voted for him. How the F can you support him?" unquote, he asked. The officer's description reveals what he and other Capitol PD officers endured that day, as many of them fought valiantly to protect the US Capitol and the very workings of American democracy. But for Black officers, as has been intimated so far, who were forced to endure anti-Black racist abuse, being called the N-word repeatedly, witnessing the parading of the Confederate flag, learning that some white officers had taken selfies with insurrectionists, and most importantly, when compared to the heightened police and National Guard response to Black Lives Matter protests the previous summer, management's decision to treat the mob rally as a free speech protest. When you take it into that consideration, the officer's description falls within the African-American protest tradition and the long Black freedom struggle against white supremacy and structural racism in American law enforcement and criminal justice. The answer to the officer's question, which ties directly to the question this series has sought to answer, this is not who we are, or is it? The answer is yes, this is America, and yes, this is who we are. And it strikes at the very heart of our professed ideas on democracy, institutions, norms, and I dare say, the idea of American exceptionalism, as my colleagues have stated. On January 27th, folks, I sought to explain how we got to this moment, what accounts for the insurrection. I talked about Donald Trump and the lost cause. I talked about the debates that were happening in Congress at the particular time, the ways in which many sought to talk about the importance of what occurred, to hold the South accountable, others saying, no, 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 let's just move forward and not really pay attention to it, not to hold the Southerners accountable for their treasonous acts. What struck me about that are the recent comments from Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who, after witnessing an overwhelming amount of evidence during the impeachment trial, declared in a recent interview, quote, "This will get me in trouble, but I don't care," unquote, he said. Quote, "Groups of agitators," unquote, he argued, quote, "are to blame for the Capitol riot and not tens of thousands of Trump supporters," unquote. Johnson continued his defense of the mob Trump incited when he said, quote, the group of people that supported Trump, the hundreds of thousands who attended those Trump rallies, those are the people that love this country. They never would have done what happened on January 6th. That is a group of people that love freedom. That's a group of people we need to unify and keep on our side. Now, this is extremely important when you take into consideration, I think, the extremely insightful talk that Dr. Perry provided us, right? That's extremely important. Will this eventually fade? Quite possibly, yes. But at the very moment we are having this discussion, there is clear evidence that says that there are a significant amount of our institutional leaders that are willing to adhere very closely to this extremist wing of the Republican Party. Let's go a little further in what Johnson said. Johnson then questioned whether the group was truly an armed insurrection. Quote, "When you hear the word armed, don't you think of firearms? Here's the question I would have liked to ask. How many firearms were confiscated? How many shots were fired?" Unquote. Johnson's comments are a 21st century version of Democrat Andrew Rogers of New Jersey's defense of the South's revolution, that Confederates had not murdered hundreds of thousands of loyal Americans, that they were not murderers, not thieves, not felons, but simply political convicts before the altar of patriotism. Johnson's comments constitute a window into a larger problem that at the very least represents a massive civics deficit in our understanding of democracy and political violence. Folks, there is a thread through all of our talks, and one has been the missing of history in informing our understanding of democracy, our understanding of how institutions and norms work. This massive civics deficit can be seen when you consider the recent remarks of Dave Ball, GOP leader of Washington County, Pennsylvania, who, in explicit support of a state GOP effort to censor Senator Pat Toomey for having voted his conscience, explicitly stated, quote, "We didn't send him there to vote his conscience. We didn't send him there to do the right thing, unquote. The struggle for supremacy of the GOP between institutionalists and its anti-establishment wing, i.e. Mitch McConnell and versus Donald Trump, has led CNN to pose the following question, quote, is the extremist wing of the GOP too big to fail, unquote. This is indeed a critical question to consider when you take into consideration a recent poll from the American Enterprise Institute that found that 55% of Republicans support use of force, i.e. political violence, as a means to stop what they perceive to be a decline of the traditional American way of life. So how do we move forward in convincing 55% of the Republican Party that political violence is antithetical to what we consider to be American values? That is something that I think I enjoy talking over with my colleagues as we try to get to an answer to the question, where do we go from here? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, a very thoughtful and insightful statement. Who else? Anybody else care to go?
I'll go ahead and jump in here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I want to thank my colleagues who've given talks across this series, as well as those who have already shared their sort of opening remarks. Echoing a lot of what we've heard, I really wanted to sort of focus in on finding the sort of commonalities as we've all taken different disciplinary or expertise-based approaches, looking at American history, looking at American institutions, current politics, even a more international perspective in addition to historical, as well as just legal. All of this comes together, and I think there is something that we can say we've been saying, and that can help hopefully frame a lot of the discussion that we'll continue to have today. So from my perspective as one of the presenters in this series, what I've heard from the other talks is that white supremacy, racism, white supremacy, racism, and many of the roots of the insurrection that happened on January 6th have long been baked into our founding. They are interwoven in our institutions, and they are also a part of the basic way of doing things in this country and have been from the beginning. However, the other thing we've heard in many of these is that our founding principles, our ideals, our values, and even broader ethical considerations all claim a special place in the American psyche and American culture, push back on a lot of this. I mean, we see it in the Declaration of Independence where we've made some of these claims. And this produces a lot of the tensions that we see that are reflected in the very title of this talk series. This is not who we are, or is it? And we have answers actually on both sides. As much as we have precedent for what happened, we also have these ideals that we've been striving to fulfill and utterly failing to fulfill at different times, but that have been guiding impulses, things that we keep returning to as a country. So thus, we can see that the insurrection did not come out of nowhere. We can also see that Trump's role, while important and central to what happened, is less as a primary cause and more as of a symptom of a much larger problem and many other problems that are built into these sort of founding tensions that we have. We see it in calls to better live up to our values. We see it in backlash to attempts to do exactly that. And we see it in squabbles over egalitarian and reactionary forces that have always been at the heart of American political discourse. In listening to all my fellow speakers' presentations, I've been struck at how we all brought different perspectives on what happened, and we've highlighted various contextual elements to it all, but all of us, in one way or another, hit on these core tensions. I think these are important realizations. I also think it's important that we don't lose sight of what happened, why it happened, and what it means that it happened. Similarly, as has been echoed in many of the talks, we need to be careful now, at this moment, not to accept a quiet peace at the expense and unity at the expense of those who have been marginalized, those who have been harmed, and those who find themselves the targets of continued discrimination. So where this leaves us, I believe, is knowing that as unprecedented as these specific elements of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th were, the underlying tensions that produced this have great precedents. They run deep in American history. What does seem newer, and I think also warrants further discussion, is how many people in positions of power not only embrace these positions embraced by those who attack the Capitol, but are willing to overlook not just attacks on those who have been historically marginalized, but attacks on themselves. This creates new versions of older problems that we all, as a country, and hopefully us as panelists, can start to address and talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tagliarina, for also very fascinating comment. Other presenters would like to prepare a statement? I don't know, Sherry, Rachel, and Eric, or Peter. Yes, no, maybe. Sherry, you're muted if you're trying to speak.
I always do that, or often do that. I was just saying that I was really wrapped up in hearing everyone else's comments. And of course, I mean, well, so much to discuss. So as the talks in this series have illustrated, there are multiple paths of inquiry through which to understand the January 6th insurrection. One of those ways is to take a historical perspective on the event, both in terms of the insurrection as part of a long history of mob violence in American history, and in terms of the history and context that led to the January 6th insurrection in particular. Now, we've spoken about January 6th, again, through multiple paths. And I guess with all of that, in terms of a historical view, what I'd like to get to is how do we see the past as how can we use the past? How can we shape it as a usable past? Now, I focused on the 1863 riots in several New York cities, but there are others we might have explored in the colonial period, but then in the 19th century, the nativist and anti-Catholic riots of the 1830s and 40s, or clashes between Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics at various points in the 19th century. And there are other examples. What they have in common is a central pillar of equating other with illegitimate, suspect, deviant, or just plain un-American, and a perceived loss of status in a society organized around a logic of privilege. Now, if we widen the scope, other violent arenas come into focus, more to the point. The legal and cultural hegemony of the slave system. Thereafter, the Jim Crow regime in America sanctioned an inherently violent social structure. When these institutions became episodically permeable, the response was brutal, indeed. So, for example, with slave rebellions, suspected as well as real, and Black self-determination met with lynching. And these examples address only overt violence. We could widen the scope further to include slower ways of repressing citizens, not only in terms of violence as in hate crimes, mass incarceration, and police brutality against Black and brown communities, but in terms of the disequities in health, education, labor, housing, we could go on. And these wider scopes too have at their core a concept of other, illegitimate, suspect, deviant, or just plain un-American and a perceived loss of status in a society organized around a logic of privilege. Again, these are old attitudes in American history, as we've all pointed to. So maybe a more immediate response must come through what makes these attitudes explode. In terms of 1863, which bears disturbing similarities with 2021, the elements were a political party or the loudest voices in it with the companion media exploiting, if not sharing, those very attitudes, an economic context that heightens a sense of dispossession, and an opposing political party that appears, at least appears, to attend to the needs of the perceived outsiders, the ones now depicted as un-American, for claiming democratic values. History warns us to heed these conditions in our own day. But ultimately, so what? We readily see the similarities, but what do we do about it? Which is what we're all asking. Unfortunately, we probably have a long road ahead, one that will involve making candid history widely available, the continuing diversification, which, as I argued last time, is more important than the concept of diversity. It's diversification meaningfully, the sharing of power equitably among elected officials and corporate leadership, and a changing population that will eventually melt the homogeneous majority. All studies show that that's going to happen. History takes a long view, and I'm hopeful about that, but I fear that this is going to be a difficult transition and may even get worse in the short term. And at least the best might be until we reach the next generation being in leadership at the soonest. Time as an element cannot be avoided, but at the same time, it's not going to happen on its own. So I would suggest that we are that transition now and every day. Every day, we are that transition in the classroom, at the workplace, at the polls, in places of worship, and around the family table.
Thank you, Dr. Cash. Very interesting. I guess, Dr. DeSimone, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Cash gave me a perfect segue into basically what has not been covered by some of our other speakers. Again, first, this speaking series was phenomenal. Again, I learned not just a lot, but very precise to see how much comes from so many different perspectives, as many of my colleagues here have touched on. And everyone's touched on something that I would have said. I've been joking back and forth here with Dr. Whitner about how everyone said anything that I would have said already. But Dr. Cash gave me a good segue in this mentioning of the other, and several other of my colleagues mentioned that what we're seeing is this backlash, this fear of traditional American values, and that brings up the ultimate question of part of our title is of this idea of American exceptionalism. That to believe in exceptionalism is to believe that you are, well, exceptional to everything else, that you are unique and therefore removed from what else exists and what else has come before you. And to bring it back into and that defies the international context of what my own presentation was trying to bring this back into, is that throughout history, every society that has ever existed has considered itself exceptional at some point in history. Whether it's to be the chosen ones of God, or whether it's to be the birthplace and cradle of democracy, whether it's to be the birthplace of law, etc., and so on. Every single society that's come along has at some point declared itself exceptional to what has come before it and what else exists around it. And so how can we today claim exceptionalism when everyone has been exceptional? To steal a quotation, to modify a quotation from The Incredibles, if everyone's exceptional, then no one is. And so that's something to consider. And then to bring in this idea of the other as well too, is that that's always been a defining trait as well too. The other has always been dangerous in history and in the present. Every society needs that other to champion against as a way to buttress their own exceptionalism as well too. Whether it is the barbarians on the other side of the river, whether it is the stronger empire on the other side of the ocean, the other is always out there to get you. And that's something that has constantly moved through history. And so that is, again, something to try to place our own experience in what we're witnessing right now, and how we better understand that. Is that at some point, the other is always presented as the enemy, the other is always dangerous, and the other is always threatening our way of life. And so there's usually a violent backlash to that. And in some cases, the first backlash is history. And that's something that in the last month alone, since the insurrection, and even leading up to that, we have seen history come under direct attack. We have seen it come under attack by our own eyes. To see what we have all witnessed and experienced, to see it rewritten as in, no, you're wrong, that's not what really happened, is precisely what my own talk is about, and has been brought up in several other talks as well too. That is something that we are, as again, I've several other of my colleagues have already now called for, and we have to be vigilant of as well too, to see it happening, to witness it for ourselves, to be told what you saw did not happen the way you saw it happen, is the fight we are now currently facing. And so I'm glad that we've had this series to bring that to light, and to see it play out for the last month allows us to see that process that is not anything new. It's not an exceptional process. It's a historical process. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. DeSimone. And last but not least, Eric Halliday and Rachel Hanna.
Thank you, everyone. As the only students on the panel, we decided to wait till last while all the quality went first. So we'll do our best to try to add something. So I'll go first. We kind of divided this into two halves, and then Rachel will finish strong. We were thinking about the title of this speaker series, and is this who we are, and the introspection and the reflection baked into that question. And from our lens, which is the legal lens, and looking at how the law has classified and approached violence of different types in different eras, the answer is yes. And that's both good and bad. And what we mean by that is that if you look at the legal history in this field, there are two strands, almost like DNA, that form the path to where we are now. And the first is systemic, institutionalized, bone-deep racist violence, and violence against other socioeconomic minorities, Jews, women, we can go on. But white supremacy, misogyny, everything that we saw on January 6th has been baked into American culture for a long time, from slavery to the different iterations of the Klan to modern day domestic terror and violence against women in different forms, like the incel movement. This is absolutely a part of American history. But another part of American history, the second strand in this DNA metaphor, is intermittent and inconsistent, passionate attempts to rectify that violence, right? So you have the evil of slavery, but then you have the brief spasm of the 13th and 14th Amendments and the Ku Klux Klan Acts and the laws during Reconstruction designed to combat at least some of those evils. You have the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s. You have the Violence Against Women Act in the 90s. You have these moments in which society takes a fresh set of eyes and looks at violence that has always been there and repression that has always been a part of the country and attempted to do something about it. And we think that we as in a country are approaching a new inflection point in which these patterns and systems of violence are always present, but now they seem to be recognized in a way that they weren't necessarily 5, 10, or 15 years ago. And the question of what we do is particularly pressing, because although this violence has always been a part of our society, the appetite to confront it is consistently inconsistent.
And so when we're thinking about not just assessing who we are, but the other question that this series was supposed to sort of look at, the what are we going to do about it? How are we going to move forward question? I think the history that so many presenters have outlined that can and should inform the problem that we're facing and how we think about the problem that was January 6th and what that means in its broader context in our society. I think it's equally important that we use history, and some of the history that Eric just laid out, to inform what we do about it. Because we've seen really good moments, which is what Eric was just talking about. We've also seen ways in which the law specifically, when trying to address this sort of problem, and for us, again, we're sort of looking specifically at domestic terrorism, but these domestic national security issues a bit more broadly, we can see that sometimes efforts to combat real threats actually end up getting turned against other groups in society, and they're often minority groups. So at its sort of broadest conception, we can think about the way that domestic national security concerns throughout history have been turned against the Japanese during World War I, against Martin Luther King, the leaders of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the way that parts of our surveillance apparatus were turned against the Muslim population in this country after 9/11. And so as much as we need to understand the severity of the problem, understand where it comes from in our historical context in this country, it's also really important to understand how that history informs what we can do and the consequences of those actions. So in the aftermath of the Capitol riot, the phrase that was most commonly being used among politicians and commentators was domestic terrorism. We saw that again and again and again from people across the political spectrum, actually. And so there seems to be some sort of broad consensus, not everybody, but a fairly broad consensus that this is a problem. It's a problem of political violence, and maybe the label is domestic terrorism. I think if we think back to the ways in which that label, or a broader domestic national security threat label, has been used against some of the more vulnerable groups in our society, we should recognize that when we're using this language, one, it has a serious cultural impact in terms of our awareness and how we think about the problem. And two, that language translates into the law, and laws have consequences. We're talking about serious criminal violations when that language of domestic terrorism or other terms like it get translated into law. And so as much as we need to assess the problem and think about it critically, I think we need to spend just as much time thinking critically about the solutions to it and the unintended consequences that poorly thought out, however well-intentioned solutions could potentially be, often for the people that we're most trying to help.
Thank you very much. Eric, Rachel, really insightful and informative. Thank you. I guess you guys have a deadline this evening, 8 o'clock, is it?
Yeah, our law school's class calendar does not respect 9 to 5, so we both had a makeup schedule.
Okay. So then I'm actually, now that everybody has made a statement, I had prepared some questions, but I think we'll probably end up feeding off each other. But I did want to toss a question out there that before Eric and Rachel leave. And I might be wrong on this, and you can just say, no, you're wrong, and that'll be the answer. But it seems to me that the January 6th rioters are legally guilty or technically guilty of acts of both sedition and insurrection. And so I'm wondering, and this is also for the whole group, if they actually are, should they be charged with both crimes, and should those charges be extended to the former president as well, if that's even possible? That's the question.
So the word sedition doesn't have a direct analog in the federal criminal code, although it's a word that we all know. The closest that there is this crime called a seditious conspiracy, which is, and let me pull it up here, 2 or more people conspiring to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to levy war against it, or it's a very long statute. And so are the rioters, the insurrectionists, whatever term we use, are they guilty of that statute? I think that it would depend on each individual rioter and why they were there, right? So if they showed up because they thought that Nancy Pelosi was trafficking children and they were there to save the kids, then maybe they're not guilty of seditious conspiracy. But if they showed up to prevent the transition to President Biden, then that's a closer call. So this is a really good question because it highlights the fact that the law doesn't reflect what we understand crimes to be, and the language that we use when talking about so-and-so has done this. Like incitement is another word that has been thrown around, which has very technical legal definitions that doesn't always correspond to how people use it. So I hope that that answers at least the first part, and I'll let Rachel take the second.
So I take it the second part of your question was about any potential liability for former President Trump. So then
or the insurrectionists.
Nicely of what Eric was just getting into. Incitement is a very particular term. It's well defined in First Amendment law, and it is a very, very high bar to meet. Again, you would have to have a shared intent and understood very narrowly between President Trump and what he was saying prior to the riot, and the intent of each individual protester who ended up inside of the Capitol building. So it's a very difficult link. First Amendment law makes it really, really hard. Incitement to violence is a very, very difficult standard, and it's certainly far from clear that the way that the media and other public commentators and politicians have sort of colloquially been saying President Trump incited this, that's not how it translates necessarily into the law or how a court would view incitement. So again, it's not clear and probably a very difficult case to make.
But the one thing that I will say to that is that that's specific to President Trump, and the frank, even if it's not legal, the heightened social protections that he has as president. I'd say for incitement for other people who were participated in the January 6th event, it's a much easier case to make because they said things on Facebook Live or on Instagram like, let's go to the Capitol, bring your guns. And no matter how people interpret what President Trump said, he didn't use quite explicit language. And so he is always going to be a special case by virtue of his position and his reflection of society. The people who don't have constitutional positions within the US government are a much easier target for the government.
Thank you. Okay. I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in on that or leave it to the legal experts. Probably. So this is actually one, I can't remember which talk I kind of started thinking about. This is probably Luke's actually because of the political side of it. But, and I think this will appeal to a broader audience. How do you all think that nativist appeals have made strange bedfellows into the same voting block? That is, groups like neo-Nazis or Proud Boys in the same voting block as evangelical Christians or even people who consider themselves to be social conservatives. Anybody who wants to jump in, unmute and go for it.
So, having actually done some research in this area, I think I'll start, and Luke can back up as well, as I imagine he's also worked on it. So, with a lot of these groups, a lot of it comes from the specific group-oriented understanding of who counts as American. So for Proud Boys and nativists, it's a particular white view of American past and American present, and for them, ideally American future. It gets a little more complicated when you get into sort of right-wing Christianity, but there is a lot of connection there as well. And we hear it in the echoes of we're a Christian nation, we're founded on Christian principles, and we're meant to be a Christian nation, something that historically cannot be actually supported by the record. And there's a lot of issues with those claims. But you can find within this root of narrowly defining us. And to go back to comments that Peter made earlier in his opening remarks, it's this question of the other, like who is us, who is the other? So it's easy to start to see how these groups can come together, but underlying all of this, even if the specific definition of who we are differs across these groups, is this broader status anxiety and the loss of social condition. So being aware of either real or perceived loss of position in society and loss of power and concern for where we're going. Add in a media empire that has been feeding this narrative for decades, and you get groups that already narrowly prescribe only some as American, very much worried about what they see as the direction of the country, combined with additional concerns over what their relative position will be. And all of this makes for surprisingly not so much strange bedfellows, but rather sensical bedfellows, where you see the people who are willing to fight the fight with you and stand up for the things that you want and push back against a lot of these things. So we see it in reactions to the Me Too movement. We see it in reactions to Black Lives Matter. We see it in a lot of the claims that supporters of Trump said early and often, that he doesn't watch his words. He says it like it is. He speaks like us. So his unwillingness, intentional unwillingness to sort of quote unquote, engage in political correctness, really allows for that appeal to hit a certain subset of groups that leads to what from the outside looks like weird alliances, but that actually make a lot more sense. And you can also see it in like the deeper roots of the Christian right becoming political in the United States, where the initial fight was over integration of schools, that then created a lot of the groundwork for these groups that were ready and active to mobilize when later things happened, like the sexual revolution in the 60s and broader cultural changes that really came to a head when the court ruled in 1973 in Roe versus Wade. So a lot of that early activism was built on the prior activism of concern over private schools and the closing down of segregated institutions.
Feel free to unmute and jump in.
Well, I'm just thinking about what Dan's been saying, and I'm thinking of a lot of other things that have been popping up frequently. I think one of the things that I find fascinating about this particular moment is there's always been a strain of messianic language in United States political or popular sort of rhetoric, but I see it more and more just at the moment. I see it as a kind of everything from the, these are the end times, Trump is part of the second coming. This is the through the usual world government black helicopter lunacy, but there's a common thread of things are coming to a head, and something significant is happening, and somebody significant is happening. That seems to be, we've been waiting for this. It's something you hear an awful lot. And that messianic thread is something that I've not seen as coherently in quite a long time in American culture.
So I'd like to weigh in as well. I certainly appreciate the insightful comments that Dr. Teclarina and Dr. Halliday have provided to your question, Dr. Whitney. When I think about this question on nativism, I think about the the monograph that I'm working on, which really looks at African-American electoral and protest activism in Philadelphia from the abolition era to the Black Lives Matter movement today. And when I think about the types of political violence that has occurred in this northern city that has this sort of ironic, this type of ironic identity, being the most liberal city during the period, particularly during the antebellum period, but also being the most anti-Black racist city in the urban north, a city that is the geographic location of where the Constitution was framed, and a city that allowed nativists to beat up, kill, and burn community, wanted to discourage any interracial alliances with abolitionists. The threat was specifically about displacement. Displacement, very important threat that that exists across the arc of history in this one city. You can trace fear of displacement in the abolition era to the rise of a police commissioner as mayor in the city of Philadelphia, and I'm talking about Frank Rizzo, a person who had not completed high school, but who had been endorsed by the then Democratic mayor, James Tate, who also was leader of the Democratic Party. And he did it because he feared that if Democrats did not embrace the move to the right, Republicans would seize control of the city of Philadelphia, and Republicans had ruled Philadelphia for 67 years, from the end of the Civil War to 1951. To preserve the Democratic in this mixture between institutionalists and progressives became dominated by essentially an anti-establishment mayor who had no hesitations on using violence. He was supported by an overwhelming blue-collar white ethnic majority because of two reasons. One, as one of them, right? They said he is one of us. He's a South Philadelphia guy, right? Secondly, he is going to keep all of these folks out of our neighborhoods, Blacks and Puerto Ricans. He's going to keep them all out of our neighborhoods. And the third reason was largely a rebellion against liberalism, because liberal policies had ceased to pay the dividends that they wanted. Liberalism was now helping those who were dispossessed. And this question about, is a lift up for someone, does that translate into a detraction or a takeaway from somebody else, right? That tension in 1970s Philadelphia, from 1970 to 1983, right, was a major, major tension. And you can draw a direct line to the political violence that ruled Philadelphia during the days of abolition and the period following Reconstruction. So I do think that Dr. Cash put us on the right plane when she started talking about the other. And what does it mean when privilege is perceived to be owned and not shared? Because in truth, for any of us to advance, it requires some degree of sacrifice. I keep going back to focusing our attention on half of the world's population, women. Half of the world's population, women, right? As a uncle of nieces, as someone who has great admiration for all of the women in his family, I find it absolutely unacceptable that their labor is not valued as much as that of men, that it is not valued as much as that of white men. To remain silent perpetuates the very problems that we are dealing with right now. But in order for that equity that Dr. Cash so eloquently talked about to occur, it's going to require a sacrifice. It's going to require specifically white men who are going to be willing to make that sacrifice. And history says that that sacrifice has often produced the type of violence that we are talking about. And it doesn't have to be political violence, folks. It can be structural violence. It can be in the form of policies. We have gotten to a point where we sensitize our eyes to the burning buildings. Equally as heinous is the invisible violence that exists within the policies themselves. And if we are not as sensitive to the invisible violence, if we don't make that which is invisible visible through these types of ongoing conversations, then the very question that you set us on, Dr. Whitner, how do we deal with these issues of nativist appeals, continues to move forward, because at the end of it, it has to do with who has the right to have access to power and resources in this country. And what does it mean to share that with the other? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Very powerful. Anybody else jumping in? I don't need to moderate this part. You guys should just jump. Kat, just unmute yourself and go for it.
No, I was waving at somebody who was coming into.
Okay, sorry.
One thing that I've been really intrigued in terms of the questions and what I'm hearing, and I'm trying to sort out in my brain, is how to parse the proximate causes of what happened in the insurrection with these larger structural forces that I think we all completely agree are deeply problematic. And for me, I have to say that I think a really important consideration in regards to what happened at the insurrection were the individual choices made by Donald Trump. And maybe that's because I tend to focus on contemporary American politics, sure. But I do think if this particular individual didn't conduct himself in the way he did, in terms of particularly denying that he lost re-election, in terms of providing more lies and misleading statements than any president we have had in the modern era, at least, when these things have been tracked more empirically. I'm not convinced we would definitely have had the insurrection. If Trump conceded, that transition month would have looked differently. Now, that's not at all to suggest that all these problems that we've identified should not have a bright light shined on them and be discussed. But the reason I bring this up is because when I think about the question that Dr. Cash and others have raised is how do we make sense of the past and what happened and move forward in a more productive direction? For me, I think of self-interest. And this has been a historic theme in American politics, going back to the Federalist Papers and how our system of government was created. And I think it's just as relevant and impactful in making sense, as Dr. Taglarina pointed out, how can people who were terrorized by the insurrection vote the way they did? And I think it comes down to perceptions of self-interest. And for me, one of the things in making sense of the impact of Donald Trump's individual choices from a contemporary political perspective is that political parties failed to control Donald Trump, and they couldn't. And typically these fringe candidates who amplify these fringe voices, like Dr. Whitner asked earlier about neo-Nazis and Proud Boys, they get weeded out through a political party process, particularly when it comes to the elite level. I'm not saying they don't exist locally throughout the country and have an impact. For sure they do, but they usually don't get to the level that Donald Trump did. Just to punctuate that, when he ran and declared his candidacy, major news organizations didn't know whether to put it on the entertainment page or put it on the news page. And I think what happened was, in part, Donald Trump came in with a huge base from his reality TV experience, where he created a certain reality about who he was as a business person and how he conducted himself, and sold that to the American people in regards to how, or at least a section of the population, that would be perceived as beneficial. And so, you know, when we think about, again, particularly from a political science perspective, what to do next or how to make sense of what has happened, I think Donald Trump personifies the perspective, the ends justify the means. And until we figure out how to either respond to that by force, because I do think violence has had a positive piece in the American story as well, in terms of the revolution, in terms of civil rights, in terms of Reconstruction and so on. But obviously, you know, that's not ideal. Peaceful social movements are another way to think about major social change. Or you have to change the incentive structure, where people like Donald Trump or politicians of either party are not able to benefit, or at least think they're going to benefit, by completely denying reality. And that's a hard puzzle to unfold, but one that I think is important, because unless it's no longer clearly in the self-interest of people to lie and distort reality for their own gain, and have the perspective that I would characterize it as the ends justify the means, it's going to be difficult to, I think, use the history and what we've talked about in a meaningful way to move forward productively.
Dr. Bluet, please jump in.
Hi there, good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, excellent. Well, I have just truly valued every talk in the series. I have been listening after the fact on most occasions. My schedule hasn't allowed me to be live, but I am following with my students in a class of mine this semester, the talks, and we're discussing them in the senior seminar, and really trying to apply sociological and anthropological perspectives and other things to our understanding of the talk. So thank you very much for running the series, and for allowing us this opportunity to engage with a larger campus community, both active students and alumni, and faculty and staff as well. The issue of self-interest, as Dr. Perry was talking about and Dr. Taglarina brought up in his earlier remarks, is one that I've been grappling with recently. And in my class this week, we were trying to talk about, and I guess my overarching question at this point is, how do we take stock of this series in light of the acquittal of former President Donald Trump? How do we take stock of what you all have shared so eloquently in light of recent events that the acquittal happened? And it goes back to this idea of how, and I realize there's other avenues potentially to hold former President Trump accountable, but how could the people who, voted against the impeachment do so when their own lives and the lives of others around them were at stake? Their lives were in danger on January 6th. And it goes back to, I think Luke Perry hit it directly, that it was this idea of self-interest and thinking of upcoming elections or how they'll be perceived by their party and so on. So this is a real key question, this idea of how did the people vote in the way they did when their lives were at stake and those around them were at stake. It was such a tense, dangerous situation, as Dr. Harris pointed out in his earlier remarks, quoting from or relaying to us the BuzzFeed article. So this idea of self-interest, how did it go down the way it went down, in the sense of the acquittal when people's lives are at stake? How do we take stock of the talks in this series because of the recent acquittal? And I'll stop there for now, but I have some other remarks I hope I get to later on. Thank you.
So I'd like to jump in response to Dr. Bray's question. And this is really just going to respond or provide a sort of ignition. Colleagues will weigh in as well. Historians always look for moments of flux in history when the hegemony of institutions and norms become fluid. And we are certainly living through one of those moments right now. I don't think that anyone expected that 67 senators, 17 Republicans were going to find Donald Trump guilty. But I do think that this is a very important question that Dr. Boyd puts before us, because many of the folk with whom I've spoken have raised the question, what does this mean when it comes to issues of accountability? Does it mean that someone with privilege can do the unthinkable and get away with it by saying what we saw is not what we saw? And I think that the answer to that is the realization that this has created a moment for having an ongoing conversation. And the key here is an ongoing conversation. As we are having this talk right now, there is a strong probability that a 9/11 type commission will emerge. And they're going to have a serious amount of power, hopefully subpoena power, to raise a tremendous amount of questions that speak to exactly what you have raised, Dr. Boyd. And they're going to delve deeply into areas that will hopefully produce a document that will be very important to our history, but very important to each and every one of us as academics who are going to take from that document and come into our classrooms. We're going to teach on it. We're going to write studies on it. We're going to be speaking to the public on it, because the impeachment trial is not the beginning or the ending of accountability. In fact, accountability is quite elastic here. It's very elastic, and I think Dr. Perry talked about that earlier. Now, I didn't necessarily believe that that the Republican Party was going to stretch back to the types of norms that reflect a type of rational governance, right? That was the reason I talked about what was happening with many of the Republicans who voted to convict, right? These folks are being censored. You have this type of establishment extremism that is growing within state and local parties, right? That's the reason I brought that into view. However, the most important part here is to recognize that accountability is not necessarily operational within impeachment. It actually has many vehicles that it can ultimately unfold. And I think that what we're starting to see is how the process of accountability, not merely in criminal courts, but in the types of questions that are going to be answered in the 9/11 type commission, in the types of ways in which the public is going to hold those accountable for what happened, and the ways that which we as academics are going to continue to keep this conversation going. It challenges us to rethink needs. And then by rethinking the way what accountability means, we can become agents of pushing a redefinition of accountability and therefore become the change that we envision. And I'll stop there so that my other colleagues can weigh in.
I'm going to actually jump in for a moment. I want to go back to actually something that Dr. Tagliarina said. And it's something I've been thinking about for a while. And it just seems that, you know, I mean, Trump's got this populist message that's been almost, it's been so simplistic and almost childlike in his rejection of anything that you'd remotely consider civil, with name calling, imitating or mocking people, things like that. That it seems to have struck a chord with people who've got kind of this resentment for government, you know, and somehow feel threatened, whether it's economically threatened, somehow losing their position, a tenuous position of even privilege in society, based on the fact that they're simply white. That it's, you know, he kind of laid that to bear. It's almost like, you know, we've had this wound of hate that's been festering underneath the bandage for probably since the Civil War and then some, that Trump succeeded in tearing off and just letting it all come out, which is really a disgusting metaphor. I apologize, but you know, we started this. You know, when I started this the series, I didn't. You know, this was about insurrection and protest, but one of the things, and this is now kind of bringing it out more, and I apologize for rambling, but is that, you know, this, as I said, it was about democracy, insurrection, protest. Where are the lines? But what's become absolutely clear is that all of these concepts, and especially democracy, are inexplicably tied to race and ethnicity in this country. And I'm wondering, you know, and this is for everybody, has that been, do we think that's been lost on the general public? Or is it, you know, we just push it off to the side and shove it under the rug, maybe? I don't know. Peter, go ahead.
Well, I think it's not the fact that the way that you phrase it, democracy is tied to race, is certainly, again, a historical reality of democracy as well too. Is that if we look back to the Greek origins of democracy, democracy was not about all-inclusive, everyone gets a say at all. It was this very small group of people get a say, and everyone else has to deal with it and its repercussions. And that's, you know, this kind of model of democracy through history has always been, how do you make it look inclusive while making it as exclusive at the same time? And so once again, that, you know, brings up, you know, this idea that America is just part of that larger trend as well too, in regards to our own approach to democracy, is that it's a nice sounding word, but in reality, it's never been about inclusiveness. It's always been about exclusiveness.
Yeah. Just unmute and jump in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in short, we're talking about a constituency that sees wearing a mask in the midst of a pandemic as an infringement of rights. This is what we're dealing with, okay? Where do we even begin to go with that? To put that in the same sentence as democracy, right? Because you can even roll that back if you want to stick with, you know, sort of Enlightenment, Lockean theory and all of that. That's not what John Locke was saying. He wasn't, right? I mean, he talks about how essentially we have to give up a little bit of our freedom for protection from our government, to protect us. And so where are the roots of that thinking, which incredibly has really, you know, just let's say a strong tendency to be wrapped up with fundamentalist Christianity. Not in all cases, certainly not among, you know, in Black churches, for example, even Black evangelical churches, who, you know, the discussion of fundamentalism or evangelicalism tends to focus on a certain demographic, which is white, right? So I'm not saying across the board, but there's an element that wraps up that sense of infringement, even with religious values. On a certain level, it's mind-boggling, right? And so the reaction is wanting to sort of shake somebody into the reality of, or our reality of what democracy is about. But of course, they have not an argument, but I would say an assertion and an attitude that pushes back against that, which I think Trump's appeal very much sits in that space. That is not really an ideology, but it's an attitude. I think it even came out here in these discussions about a brand. It might have been Dr. Harris who talked about Trump in terms of a brand, or I could be getting that wrong, who said that. There's not really anything that you can argue with there. And one of the things we know is that when you construct an argument, it has to be something that can be debatable. It has to be based upon fact. And in large part, we're not really confronting that. That's not what we're up against. So how do you overcome that sort of set of attitudes? It's a very difficult question.
I could not agree more. I really could not agree more, Dr. Cash. As you were thinking, as you were talking, I kept thinking about the justification for lynching. It just kept going over and over in my mind. Today, I had the privilege of delivering a talk on the World War II origins of the Black Lives Matter movement to the US Department of Education. And I was asked this question. I was asked the question, how do you explain what occurred in Black Wall Street, the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma? What accounts for why a white mob destroyed this very productive, segregated section of Greenwood, of Oklahoma in 1921? And of course, the trigger for it was that a young Black man, while working as a elevator operator, attacked a young white woman. Well, there's no evidence of that at all, but it was enough to bring a white mob angrily into the Greenwood section, massacre more than 300 people, burn down Black homes, Black businesses. It was a thriving Black middle class community. And ultimately, no one has accounted for to this very day. The question was about why has that particular event remained so silent in our discussions of history, right? We're talking about erasure, right? What happens when we don't talk about something? It becomes marginalized and then ultimately erased from the consciousness. But the reality here was that there was no rational justification for this action. It was about the realization of power, who had it and who did not, and how it could be wielded in an extra legal capacity without fear of any repercussion whatsoever. When I talk about Johnson's comments excusing the actions of the insurrectionists, and yes, I see them as insurrectionists, he is ultimately saying there's no way these folks could be accountable of the acts that we all saw them engage in. But there's no doubt whatsoever that there was nothing rational about the way they responded to an outright lie. And all of us as academics, all of us as critical watchers realized that we were living in an era where truth had become secondary to alternative truth. And that you could fabricate something and say that it is true, right? This was the core of Dr. D. Simone's talk, right? How propaganda led to the rise of the Third Reich. And so in the hunt for the response to your question, Dr. Whitner, I think that we have to recognize that there isn't always a rational answer to it. It is about recognizing how the irrational can appeal to the neurotic, to those who are very anxious about something that they are going to lose, and how they will grab onto that and use that as justification for the unthinkable. Thank you.
If I could jump in, I completely agree with the sense of loss being a prominent theme in understanding behavior here. I'd like to touch on a couple of things that were mentioned. First, when we think about mask wearing in the Republican Party, 73% of Republicans per recent Pew survey do not think it's a problem to wear a mask. 27% do, so you can argue that's large. Compare that to Democrats, 90% don't think it's a problem to wear a mask in the context of the pandemic. 10% do. So it's a 17-point difference, and vast majorities of both party members per reputable public opinion studies, assuming we look at Pew that way, hold that view. Why do I bring that up? Just because I have no interest in defending people who are in positions of power to make meaningful change in the wake of the insurrection and failed to do so. Let me make that absolutely clear. As a scholar, at the same time, though, I'm very interested in understanding from a psychological perspective why people made the decisions they did. And I think something I've observed over the last 4 years, particularly as I've ventured into covering national politics, is that there's a tendency for judgments on conservatives to be influenced by conceptions of normative conceptions about what people think are right. And that's understandable. I also have no problems with normative arguments and criticisms of both parties. But part of me is also kind of reluctant to say this, but also a bit concerned that that can complicate empirical assessment of political behavior by prominent Republicans through the Trump era, and particularly around this moment. So to address Dr. Bluet's question, and this has come up before, I mentioned self-interest. Let me take it a step forward. Why did Republican senators not vote to convict? Compartmentalization, right? This is a lens of analysis in political science to understand how, from a psychological perspective, people can set aside, put in a compartment, really bad things about people and still accept and or support other things they do that they think are good. So I think the challenge as we wrestle with this is I try to put myself in that position. If I literally was in a situation where someone, including the president, put my immediate life in danger, and my whole career was wrapped up to some degree with this person, or at least with this team that we both belong to, I can understand, and I would even argue, perhaps to differ with some of my colleagues, that it would be rational to say that I'm going to perceive my self-interest in a way that even though Trump is a jerk, I don't like him, I don't like what he did, right? My career, my livelihood, my power, my influence, the millions of dollars I have access to, I'm not going to risk all that. And so, by all means, those people should be criticized if people want to criticize them. And I understand the perspective that it should be a vote of conscience and there's much larger concerns at stake here. Okay. But, congressional scholarship would say that being reelected is the primary assumption that those scholars use to understand congressional behavior. And I think you can make an argument as to how that makes sense. Now, again, I don't agree with that argument, but I wanted to share that as we try to make sense of this. And the last thing I'd like to touch on is in terms of Dr. Whitner and sort of Trump amplifying or resurrecting latent attitudes. I think one thing that we haven't mentioned is that Trump's public communication, which is something I've researched, is considered the talk radio. It's something that's been around since the 1980s. And he's taken that, and it's appropriate to talk about when Rush Limbaugh has died. He's taken that, and that's a person he awarded the Congressional Medal of Freedom in a controversial move. He's taken that and used that as a way to, again, mobilize political support for partisan and personal gain. So I guess the last quick thing I'll add is that compartmentalization is not unique to Republicans in this moment. I'm very careful in trying to draw equivalencies, but there have been other presidents who are Democrats who have lied about doing horrible things under oath. Bill Clinton's a prominent example. Again, not the same, but why did Bill Clinton get more popular when he was being impeached? Because people said, well, that's personal, unethical or moral behavior, right? Having an inappropriate relationship with somebody that's the age of his daughter in the White House. I think the vast majority of the Americans, irrespective of the party, would say that's not good, right? But people could set that aside. He could get reelected. His popularity could go up. And again, I understand it's not the same, and you can draw a dichotomy between personal behavior and professional behavior. But I think it's a bit of the reality check as well in thinking about this issue with compartmentalization and how that's certainly not unique to Republicans, though that's certainly a prominent theme, I think, of trying to understand what's going on.
If I may be able to build off of what Dr. Perry said, I completely agree. Compartmentalization is not unique to Republicans, and it's certainly not even unique to this time. When we look at this through the long Black freedom struggle lens, we see how Blacks continued to support the Republican Party following Reconstruction, even though the Republican Party turned their back on Black civil rights. You might ask yourself the question, why? Why would Blacks who were being attacked in the city of Philadelphia continue to sing the praises of the Republican Party? And it had little to do with self-interest in that particular era. It had to do with making interest political support in order to policies that would bring about protections not in the city of Philadelphia, but to also leverage to form I think I froze it.
Yeah,
You did, yeah.
you're gonna have to come back in on
Okay.
your phone again like you did last time.
All right. So let me simply conclude by saying that we should not look at this very narrowly because it is a very complex issue, and Dr. Perry is correct. We need to really situate why people make the decisions that they do, but I would dare say that it's not always personal, right? That there are larger interests that are at stake as well. That's what history tells us. Thank you.
I'd like to jump in here as well to pick up on some of these threads from Dr. Harris and Dr. Perry as well, and actually start by defending some Republicans. As Dr. Harris mentioned earlier, no one expected 17 Republicans to vote against Trump, but 7 did. That's not nothing, and it does speak to something. So we've had 4 presidential impeachments. 2 of them were Trump. If we look at the first 2 presidential impeachments, none of the parties voted against their own president to remove at that point. Mitt Romney bucked that trend the first time around, being the first person to, in the Senate to vote against, or in terms of removal, the president of their own party. That moved up to 7 in the course of 1 year. Now, he was no longer president, and maybe that's a part of it, but I think it does speak to that there are more tensions that are happening here. And as we look at some of these numbers, especially poll numbers about Republicans, one of the things we need to keep in mind is as some parts, and it's not much, but as parts of the Republican Party grew more and more distasteful with Trump, they stopped calling themselves Republican. They might still vote that way, but what we see is a drop off of those who don't like Trump in the party, which leads to, by virtue of who's left, an increase in support for Trump. So when we see things like that 55% say they are willing to engage in violence to protect the American way of life, that's not necessarily reflective of all Republicans by virtue of what we're seeing with how people are aligning. But I do think in talking about compartmentalization and psychology, Professor Perry went in a really good direction, that there is a lot of work on political ideological differences and political psychology. And one of the, there's a handful of things, but part of what we know is that people who identify as conservative and people who identify as liberal process information differently and view things differently. Study after study has found that black and white moral thinking is far more prevalent in people who self-identify as conservatives, meaning they're more likely to see things in a right and wrong sort of lens. And if that gets filtered through a media or a president, if you want to just look at Trump directly, who keeps saying the election was stolen. Well, if the election was stolen and it was wrong, you have to act on that. The same thing with the conspiracy theories of children in harm that keeps coming up. So it speaks to this. Add in that one of the other common findings is that there's much more authoritarian sympathies in people who self-identify as conservative. Now we start to get this mix that can lead into embracing a figure like Trump. And you add in one of the third common findings, and that's fear stimuli. Response to fear stimuli is stronger in conservatives. fMRI tests have found this. And this includes things like political stimuli, like, oh, look, people you don't like. But it also includes things like snakes, spiders, other sorts of things that have nothing to do with politics. Self-identified conservatives react much more strongly than self-identified liberals to fear. So fear and authoritarianism and a black and white sort of perspective on the world, combined with racial animosity and these other factors, really does create sort of the ideal brew for someone like Trump to come in and say, they stole the election from me, they stole it from you, you need to fight like hell. And that can mean anything, which is sort of the benefit of his defense. But in speaking to some of the points that Dr. Cash brought up, the other thing is people, regardless of political ideology, really don't respond well to rational arguments. It turns out in multiple studies, when you present people with evidence that their beliefs are wrong, they're more likely to believe what they believed before, which, in answer to these question from Dr. Blue that started all of this. So what do we do? To some extent, we have to do the hard work of emotion and empathy and reaching out and talking to people. And we can present evidence, but if we are only presenting evidence, it's not going to work. Because underlying all of this is, I'll tell through a little bit of story. So I'm reminded of one of my grad seminars on American political ideology. And one of the grand questions throughout as we looked across time is there an American ideology? And to sum it up in the words of one of my really astute grad colleagues, if there's an American ideology, it's that everyone else is wrong and you can't tell me what to do. Sort of from the people that came over for either making money purposes, religious purposes, or any of those things, to fighting the king and the things that we saw as tyrannical, to everything else. So much is wrapped up in this sort of ethos of, I know what's best for me. I mean, we ended up with federalism literally because this is sort of the way we could get there, which means these trends are always going to make it hard. And it's also what emphasizes and comes back to what I said in my opening remarks of these tensions between these great principles of equality and the political reality that we don't like equality in a lot of ways, or we like equality for people that are like us in some way, but not like those other people, whoever it is, and it's varied across time as to what that group is. which creates a lot of problem when it comes to accountability, which goes back to what Dr. Harris was saying before. And I 100% agree with everything he said about impeachment not being the end all be all of accountability. And there are other ways, and there should be a 9/11 style commission and all of these things. But I also wonder if we've ever had meaningful accountability as a country. Dr. Whitner at the start in his opening remarks mentioned that, well, good thing we won the war with our firebombing. Otherwise, that would have been, war crimes. And yeah, by most definitions of war crimes, we've committed a bunch. But if you come out on the winning side, or at least strong enough to enforce things, you don't have to face it. Trump twice now has been impeached, but not held to account in the Senate. We've never held a president to account in the Senate. And as Professor Perry mentioned earlier, Clinton got more popular during that whole process, which creates this very real issue is if we don't have real accountability mechanisms, and I forget who said it, but someone said it recently, that the fear, I think it was Rankin, but the fear isn't that Trump will become president again. The fear is that he will run again and lose again and claim that the election was stolen again. And that's where, if the Republican Party or America in general, but really given what we know about in-group dynamics, it has to come from the Republican Party. If they don't hold him to account, and based on the fact they couldn't stop him from running in the first place, there's no reason to expect they will, we're likely to be here again. And the really scary thing is typically failed coups come before successful coups. And that's something we have to wrestle with. So how do we stop that from happening? I think it's going to find a way to come together that, unlike most of the ways we've done it historically as Americans, doesn't involve just turning a blind eye to what happened.
Thanks. Fascinating. I want to actually bring up a question from one of the students, and then Dr. DeSimone, you get to jump back in. But Tommy Morial asked a really good question. Do you think that addressing these issues with students at a young age could help prevent some of the problems in the future? And I think we actually just answered this one, or Dan just answered this one, or is it possible to change the minds of American adults? So.
Yeah, I wasn't going to steal your moderator's rights. I was actually going to segue off what Dan was saying and bring that question in myself, because I'd been thinking about that. And I absolutely agree with what Dan is saying and what several others have said as well too. This idea of accountability and how do we move on and how do we go from there and how do we teach this kind of thing? And I've seen it constantly repeated over the last month. All these sycophants, all the people supporting Trump, all the the flip-flopping Republicans, the Kevin McCarthys, things like that. The constant refrain is history will judge them. Well, yes, again, I'm a historian. I'm judging them already, kind of a thing like that. And history will judge them. But the other side is that history isn't going to truly judge them until generations from now. History judging them right now isn't going to do my kids any good. It's not going to do my, hopefully future grandkids any good. And because history proves that that's not how it works. Is that most of our condemnations of some of the biggest historical figures in history are found centuries, thousands of years later by some monk finding a book tucked behind other books. Because the person who wrote that and wrote these condemnations didn't want to end up with their head on a pike. And that's the kind of sad reality. Speaking as a historian, that's the sad reality, is that we play up these great moments and we've heard the language. These, again, Dr. Harris bringing in Ron Johnson. These are the real Americans that you saw marching on the Capitol. That we are seeing this back and forth fight over history right now. And I absolutely agree with Dr. Taggs that, vigilance, to go back to what he said in his opening statement, vigilance is what we have to do, is that we can't turn a blind eye to this. And the attitude is that we can start making history judge the sycophants, the supporters, the guys with buffalo horns on their head. And things like that at this moment right now by actively engaging with this and saying that is That's not supposed to be us. Unfortunately, it is us right now, but that's not supposed to be us. How can we make this grand American experiment actually work, learning from what we just saw in our own eyes? And so teaching right now is the way to do it. Teaching the younger children, engaging with the adults who are willing to listen to evidence and things like that, and saying, do you see why this doesn't line up, or why this was potentially wrong, or why this was dangerous? What does it mean in 4 years if this all happens again? Because absolutely, that's another rule of history. A failed coup is the practice rehearsal for the real coup. So vigilance, I agree completely. That's the way to go. That's the way to address this. And so, yeah, absolutely, addressing these issues to students now is the way to do it. And that's from a young age on up. That's how you prevent the perversion of the history of saying, nope, those were the real Americans, the ones throwing down American flags, the ones carrying Confederate flags, the ones beating police officers with Blue Lives Matter flags. You can't say that those are the real Americans and just say, oh, well, what an idiot. You have to actively engage with it and have to cut that off at the pass.
Can I jump in here, David?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I was thinking about the second part of that question. I mean, how do you help? How do you change the minds of adults? Can you change the minds of adults? How do you help them see the error of their ways? And I've been fascinated by some of the stories that have been out there about people who were either at the Capitol on January 6th or very sympathetic to that, or at least involved in the QAnon area and deep in that part of the web, who have realized that they have made a mistake. And there are increasing numbers of those out there. And usually it has nothing to do with rational arguments. Now, I'm a philosopher. I wish it had everything to do with rational arguments. I wish I could simply lay out all the truth and the logic and the first postulates and everything else would flow from that. It doesn't. What tends to make people change their mind is some confrontation with a reality that they can't deny. That is beyond it even for them. So there's some really interesting stories about people for whom the tipping point was the assertion that on March 3rd, Trump would be reelected, or come back to claim his rightful election back again. And other people have found other points. And I think the second thing to note about that is that on the whole, people do not change their minds in moments of duress. It's not when you're on the in the middle of the insurrection, in the middle of the riot, in the middle of anything else that you change your mind. It's later. It's in calmer moments. And I think part of what we have to do as people who are not going to be, I'm not going to be confronting anybody with cow horns on his head and all that stuff, because I don't move in those circles. But I do encounter people who believe that the end times are upon us and Donald Trump is the harbinger of those. And I need to make real the contradictions that they themselves are tacitly acknowledging sometimes, and allow them space. And that's the tricky part. I mean, I really want to get in there and engage and feel like if I could just get more pugilistic and more effective in my arguments, things would happen. But you've got to allow people room to change, and you've got to give them space and the comfort to change. Because one of the things that you talked about already, Peter, and other people have as well, is the extent to which these actions are driven by fear. Fear of loss, fear of future potential loss, fear of lack of identity, fear of all sorts of things. People don't react well to fear. And if we're going to help Americans change their minds, we have to actually try and find space that is safe enough and comfortable enough for them to do it.
I'll jump in. I as an educator, I agree education is very important. But having spent 20 years in rural America, living in Nebraska and Utah, if a PhD, perhaps who subscribes to a liberal ideology, comes to ranch country, trying to educate idiot farmers, I'm being loose with my language. I know nobody said that directly. That's not welcome. And is, as Tags was saying, I mean, I think there's different perspectives on reality. So I'd like to point that out. I'd like to point out too that it seems like a lot of the conversation is sort of very focused on conservative efforts to categorize people as the other. I think particularly in this election cycle, Democrats embraced a somewhat similar narrative that, to use Joe Biden's words, this was a fight to the soul of America. And so there's a bit of a tit for tat rhetorically in regards to that. And you can trace similar currents back to Hillary Clinton talking about deplorables, Barack Obama from my home state, citing how rural conservatives in Southern Illinois cling to guns and religion. So I encourage people to consider, and I think this is a theme of how Dr. Holliday was addressing this, think about how they approach these conversations, because they are difficult and they are sensitive. And I think it comes down to relationships. And so to answer the question directly, I think the best thing we can teach, particularly young people, is empathy. And there's a lot of psychological studies that are coming out now that is the best skill you can teach young children. I mentioned in my talk, I have young children. That's something that's very important to me. Then when we think more about young adults, travel, to the extent that you can do that, is important. Not self-segregating and surrounding yourselves, again, to the extent that you have mobility, you at least have the decisions over who you associate with. But if you continue to associate yourself with people that are just like you and just think like you, you're gonna have a hard time understanding people who are different than you. And unfortunately, we see trends nationally in America where people tend to work, tend to live, tend to marry people who are like them. And I get that. I've done some of that in my own life, but I've also done some other things. I've had encounters as an undergraduate student where I met somebody, we became friends, we were roommates, we're moving in together, Confederate flag goes up on the wall. I didn't see that coming. And I won't go into the whole story, but what happened from that point was a series of deep and meaningful conversations, research, travel, dialogue, talking about experiences that led to my friend who ended up being the best man in my wedding, getting to that point, and me getting to a very different point and trying to collectively get better and explore two very different views about that flag and what it meant. And then when I think of graduate school, I worked with a dissertation advisor who I think is one of the smartest people I've ever encountered. He had a completely different political ideology than I did. That's not common, but it was so beneficial for me. So these are some of the types of things I think about, particularly when we're talking about how to address these difficult conversations and help handle them, particularly when we think about young people.
So I'd like to build on that. I want to say that, Tommy, I think that you raised, as I put in the chat, an excellent set of questions. And I'd like to build on what Dr. Perry and others have said. Not only was Dr. Holliday right, you have to give people room, but the only way that this is going to get better in response to Dr. Whitner's question is by teaching empathy. But Tommy talked to us about young people versus old people. And I'm often reminded of what young people say when they take the Intro to Africana Studies course. They ask this question: why did it take us getting to your course before we got exposed to a diverse history? Why did it have to wait until this particular moment? And we chose this course because we heard other people say, yeah, you should take that course, right? And this is extremely important because we're trying to talk about the whole question of American exceptionalism, but the whole question of American exceptionalism is what's being taught in our local education system across the country. And it glorifies the very thing that we are putting holes in right now, right? And so folks like Tommy come to us with this already preconceived understanding that somehow there's something exceptional about being an American. And because we are preparing them for the global economy, and because neoliberalism is such a dominant ideology in higher education, we don't really have the space as historians and social sciences to do the work that Luke absolutely says we must do, teach empathy. But structurally, we are constrained in our ability to do that. And not just in higher education, because as I said earlier, this seed starts at the secondary level. The second point I want to say is this. I did a year as a visiting professor at Wesleyan University, and right around the time that the Black Lives Matter movement was really getting off the ground. In 2015, there was a young man, happened to be white, veteran, who was attending Wesleyan University. He fancied himself as a sort of journalist for Fox in training. And he wrote a series of columns attacking the Black Lives Matter movement on campus, and he essentially said they are an anti-police, anti-white group of hate, which of course sparked a major issue. Young Black activists on the campus found him downtown and cornered him. Now, they didn't attack him, but they intimidated him. And then he came back, wrote another column about how he was intimidated. And of course, the institution seeking to protect his brand came out and made a political choice to support him. The short of it is that there was a moment when the president tried to bring the institution together. And this was after a young woman climbed up the flagpole in Charleston to bring down the Confederate flag. Some of you all may remember that. On that stage, I sat with other speakers, and I said that it's not that the young man should be denied the right to assert his view, but that if he is going to use the vehicle of the student newspaper, then his view can be critical, but it should be informed. How do you write an uninformed view when you have access to all of these books and all of these professors on an institution of higher learning? How do you do that? How do you not know that the history of race-based predatory policing is rooted in the transatlantic slave system, that it is grounded in colonial rule, and that it's not something that is unique to the United States, but it's a global dynamic? How do you not know that? And then a teachable moment came. I extended an invitation to him to come and see me. And he came to my office, and he was ready to do battle, right? The ex-soldier. And then I started to say to him, tell me where'd you serve? And he is all defensive, telling me where he served. Then I said, I trained soldiers like you. Excuse me? Yes, I'm a former drill sergeant. I'm a former criminal investigator with the state police. His whole posture started to change. A Black man who was this Africana Studies professor was actually a part of my crew. He was in the military. And he was not just a criminal investigator with the state police, but he was also a police instructor. I extended him an invitation to take a course with me. He did. In December of 2016, December of 2015, NPR contacted him to say, tell me, how are things going on campus since you talked about being accosted? He said, I have a different view. What accounts for that? I took a course with Dr. Harris. There's always a teachable moment, particularly with our young people. But let's be clear, we are fighting an uphill battle because of the structural foundations of secondary education and the way that neoliberalism defines space and access to resources in the academy.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. I'm going to read a comment from Facebook. Says, I think, this is from Denise Naveau. She says, I think we need to keep the focus on accountability, foster discussion of what accountability means, and don't get it dismissed as cancel culture. I think there's some wisdom in there. We had a question from Nolan who said his TV is too loud. But but his roommate's TV is too loud, I should say. He's wondering. This is actually for Dr. Perry. Where do you see an urban-rural dynamics and tensions are at play more broadly?
Thank you for your question. I think it's an interesting one, and I think, as I mentioned in my talk, America is a particularly large country, both in terms of population and geography, and people's socialization process has a big impact in terms of how they make sense of reality, including political realities. And so I think we see, particularly in this hyper-partisan era, a growing divide between people's experiences, understanding of society and politics, depending on whether they're predominantly living in an urban, suburban, or rural environment. And there's no real easy way to increase understanding across those different community types. But I think trying to find relationships, teachable moments, as Dr. Harris put so well, being curious in terms of encountering people who are different from you, whether that's socially, whether that's in school, whether that's in the workplace. It's so tempting when we get confronted with a view that we find very hard to accept to begin telling people why they're wrong, rather than taking a moment and asking, why do you think that? How did you get to that view? So I think those are some of the types of things I try to think about in bridging those divides.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they would like to say. Oh, Laura Kleppinger, Dr. Kleppinger.
Hi. Yeah, I was thinking about the empathy question and how we can teach empathy. I teach anthropology, as most of you know. In many ways, it's what I strive to do in teaching about, the discipline of anthropology. I like that the way this conversation was going. I was thinking about Seth Holmes, who's a medical anthropologist, at the end of his book, Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. He says something about like how to solve all the problems that he's presented in this book. It's about migrant farm workers, and basically his answer is do more anthropology. So I feel like some of the conversation here today goes with that argument that I usually like to end my class with. But when I teach intro, I actually put the words that you open with, Dave, Dr. Whitner, on the screen. This idea as a founding concept of the United States that all men are created equal. And when you were talking in your presentation, in your opening remarks, you said all men are not created equal. And I just took a little note because I always kind of teach that line as an aspirational one, right? Because the next lines are endowed by their creator with, right, these inalienable rights. And so it's not saying that all people are equal or exist in equal terms, but that they should. And that's kind of my starting place where, and so I guess I'd like to know if I'm teaching that wrong from the political scholars, because I think it gives us a place to start from, or to appeal to people across differences, right? Is that, that founding myth is we have to hearken with the reality that it hasn't been the case, right, throughout our history. But by understanding people across beliefs or across different experiences, we can work toward that, aspirational founding mythology. So tell me if I'm doing it wrong.
I wouldn't say you're doing it wrong at all. It's definitely aspirational. And in the context of the Declaration, in this, grand sort of 2-paragraph preamble where we're laying out, liberal philosophy saying it's not kings that'll rule, but it's people, and it's people choosing a government for themselves. That this equality is a moral equality. It has to be. So it has to be a sort of moral, and we can kind of get that even as, those words were themselves written by a slaveholder. So like we've got big problems right off the start, but wrestling with that becomes then part of this story. And, as someone who also teaches human rights, like one of the things that we have to get across to students is like the essence of human rights is everyone is of equal moral worth. Everyone has dignity. Everyone deserves to be treated fairly and the same. I mean, the same can mean different things in different contexts. And it's one of those things like students are like, so like, wait, what about Hitler? Like, well, yeah, him too. Like, so Hitler has human rights? Yeah, Hitler's got human rights. But like, what about, and you can, go through any list of people. And that's kind of what we're saying is like, that's the way it should be. And I think what we've heard from all of these talks and again today is we haven't been good about that ever. But as I think Dr. Harris pointed out earlier, and Dr. Cash definitely hit on some of this as well, this sort of recurring theme throughout American history is we're really good at calling out that we're not good at it. Usually in these sort of like punctuated moments, like it's not an accident that the Seneca Falls Declaration, the Declaration of Sentiments, models itself after the Declaration of Independence. It's not an accident that in his Gettysburg Address, Lincoln reminds us of the Declaration. It's not an accident that about 100 years after that, with the March on Washington, that King is telling us we made all of these promises and they still haven't been delivered, because there's a lot of rhetorical power in those promises and in those goals and in those aspirations. And I mean, we heard echoes of it in, if you want to look at Amanda Gorman's poem that she gave at Biden's inauguration, which is phenomenal. And if you somehow have made it this far without hearing it, you absolutely should go watch it when you're done. But she talks about this sort of work in progress. And I think that is the right way to read it, even if it were some sort of assertion at the time of we're equal, we're free, get out of our way, please, because there's, a pretty big, please don't fight us. I mean, we knew it was happening. But yeah, I think that is the sort of right way to think about it for what that's worth.
If I may jump in here quickly, I absolutely agree with that discussion. I would just add to that too, something that becomes problematic then is an embracing of the Declaration to an extent that leads to a perspective of color blindness, right? And so along with that, then we have to get into, and part of teaching, right? We have to get into the institutions that have created and recreate every day disequity, maldistribution of power in many different ways. So I think, that's another hurdle, is to get to that level of understanding. And I guess this is where, Dr. Kleppinger and I have continued a little bit of our conversation from a few sessions ago in terms of the place of love. I guess that's where empathy has to come together with also, an embracing of complicated realities. And that, if we adhere to the words, if we adhere to Jefferson's words, or we try to do that every day, it's just not enough. But, I guess that also speaks to what several of my colleagues are setting out about teachable moments and about patience and, also trying to have empathy for the student who may be a formal student or might be someone who, you know, you're trying to enlighten. I don't mean that in a demeaning way of sort of professor student, or not that that is to me, it is not in any sort of hierarchical way. Yeah, so I think we have to think about all that too.
If I might build on that, that ties the whole question of empathy together, and I'm looking at what Shelby raised, what Dr. Kleppinger has said, Dr. Perry, Dr. Taclerini, and Dr. Cash. I'm reminded of something that Dr. King said. He said that the arc of justice bends slowly, but it does bend, right? It does eventually bend. And it goes back to the point that Dr. Whitner said, reminded us on staying focused on accountability. The long Black freedom struggle is about accountability. It's about accountability to an idea of what it means to be a human being. From the moment that Black-skinned Africans were abducted during the transatlantic slave system, they resisted. They continued to resist in new forms of oppression through the ways in which they adapted different types of languages, different types of responses to oppression. The fact that they escaped, all of this was designed to create and be a human being and who did not. And even though they did not have the power, the fact that they resisted caused the political discussion to change. It caused the media to begin to reflect their actions. That ultimately is how we as scholars can look back at that moment. If their actions had not, we would not be able to really talk about it right now. And that's really very important to see, as I stated earlier, that we should not solely understand accountability within the context of institutional responses. Accountability has its birth in a much more organic process. And the one thing that we can do in this country is raise our voice. We can, young folk who we have the responsibility to shape their intellectual development, of the power that exists in their voice, the power that exists in their pen. The fact that Donald Trump was not held accountable by the Senate, as I stated and as Dr. Taclerini has stated, is not the end all. In many respects, it may just well be the beginning. And I think that we really, really should see that at the core of this is the ability of people to become agents of change. And to become agents of change, we have to reconceptualize what accountability means and empower those who we teach and those who we engage in the broader civic sphere to understand that at its core, we, the average individual, has the power to hold the idea of democracy and freedom and the country that put forward these ideas. We have the ability of holding the country accountable, because that's what Dr. King talked about, and Dr. Taclerini was absolutely correct. The March on Washington, I think it was either Dr. Taclerini or Dr. Cash, was absolutely correct. The March on Washington was about saying, hey, we got this check. It's much more like a promissory note. If we drop it, it's going to bounce, right? It's going to bounce because we come here to cash it and we don't know if there's money in the bank. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what Black Lives Matter activists are saying. That's what Me Too activists are saying. That's what the LGBTQ activists are saying, right? So there is a moment here when we can really define what it means to be accountable and empower our young folks to change the political conversation by redefining accountability and then looking to build a movement on those redefinitions.
I think Santia had a question he wanted to ask.
I wanted to ask Dr. Harris a question because I never got to. My parents always taught me to appreciate African American history as they open doors and opportunities to other minorities. What can other minorities do to help the movement, or if you have any other suggestions?
Thank you, Cynthia, for that question. I think that one of the best things that all historically marginalized groups can do is twofold. One is to exercise self-determination and building strong communities, strong platforms, strong institutions. And then once you have the ability to do that, to then move forward and engage in alliances, building political alliances that will ultimately seek to improve the conditions that historically marginalized people face. Now, this is something that Malcolm X was initially against in the post-war period when he was asked during his recent departure from the nation, do you see a position where liberal whites could be helped? I believe no. But upon returning from the Hajj, where he saw this international community of Muslims who were as opaque in their complexion as those in the Sudan and as white in their complexion as any white person you would see, but adhering to the principles of the Quran and in a type of interracial way that frankly he had never seen before. He returns from the Hajj with a renewed sense of how to move forward. And it is all about developing a strong base, and then from that base, developing strong alliances. And when asked the question, do you intend on pushing this thing forward and pressing for civil rights, he said no. I am looking to move this to the International Criminal Court because what's happening in the United States is a question of human rights. It is not just something that's happening in the United States, it's happening with global communities of color. Why? Because colonialism, Cynthia, created the modern world. And the same repressive issues that we are talking about in this country were used to subordinate global communities of color all over the world. We are truly talking about a global issue right now, and we should never lose sight of that. And so your question is extremely important. There is an opportunity here to not only address concerns that are important to the African American community and the African diaspora at large, but to also see an opportunity to build alliances with other global communities and, quite frankly, other marginalized people who were not a part of the founding fathers' conceptualization when it came to empowering them, right? Again, I go back to the realization, half of the world's population are women, right? If we cannot talk about empowering women, everything that we're talking about is meaningless. I hate to be reductionist, but I feel quite correct in that point. I hope I addressed your question.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to read one last statement from Ryan. And I think we've probably come pretty close to the end of our discussion, at least time-wise. Ryan says, I'm not sure who said this earlier, but someone offhandedly mentioned the teaching of candid history. Teaching history how it actually happened is something that I personally think is extremely important, especially at the early levels in primary school. What I immediately think of is Christopher Columbus. We as students didn't find out until so much later that he really did some heinous things. I mean, we had a day off from school for him, so he must be good, right? And I think that's a really great point to end on. We got a lot of work to do, I think, in all fields. And I really appreciate the time and effort everyone has spent on this. The audience too, you guys have been fantastic. We've literally reached thousands of people with this series. Hundreds of people every night have been on between, participating and listening and taking this in between Facebook and Zoom. So the reach and I think the impact of these talks is far greater than probably any of us realize. So I'd like to thank everyone, all the panelists and our audience and participants as well. So thank you. And since I've got the floor, I'd like to let everybody know that next week on the 23rd for Black History Month, that Dr. Harris will be giving us a talk going a little bit different direction, I think, but it is titled, "What Accounts for the Peculiar Relationship Between the African-American Community and the American Medical Profession, A Brief History of Race and Racism in Public Health and Medicine," which is frankly an incredibly timely subject given the pandemic and the recognition of how racism and the history of racism is impeding the efforts to get the population vaccinated. So I look forward to Dr. Harris's talk. And again, thank you everybody for a fantastic series. I've already been contacted with folks saying, hey, towards the end of the semester, could you all get together again and do some more? So just as a heads up, I might be tapping you again. So thank you everybody. Have a wonderful night. Great semester. And I'll see some of you in class tomorrow morning. Take care.
And
Bye-bye.
thank you, David, for putting
Thank
this
you.
together as quickly as you did. This was a phenomenal.
It's all you guys.
Here, 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 here.
All you guys. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.